This video is about Darwin and the process of natural selection. One of the most famous scientists, actually maybe the most famous scientist, is named Charles Darwin. In the 1800s, Charles Darwin sailed around the world and collected fossils and organisms from a variety of countries. One place he stopped, the Galapagos Islands off the coast of South America, is where he found some new organisms that were nowhere else in the world. He discovered tortoises with strange-shaped shells and birds with bright blue feet, lizards, and many other different species of finches. What he noticed about these organisms is that they were all very similar to the organisms found on the mainland of South America. They were similar, but not identical. This got him wondering, why were these organisms on an island different from the organisms on the mainland? Throughout the rest of his lifetime, he collected evidence, wrote books, and discovered the theory of natural selection and evolution. Everything that we will be discussing in this entire unit all started with this man, Charles Darwin. So, what is natural selection? We'll first go through the components or parts of natural selection, and then we'll end with an overall definition of natural selection. Remember that every individual is different because they all have different DNA sequences. You can also say that they have different gene sequences. This means the exact same thing. For example, all of these snails, plants, dogs look similar to each other, but they are all slightly different, even if they had the same parents. What causes these differences? Well, we discussed this in the last few units. Mutations can cause differences in DNA sequences, and so does sexual reproduction. We have different zygotes are formed as a result of different eggs and different sperm. We have crossing over, we have the law of independent assortment, and we have random fertilization. A random egg and a random sperm come together to form a random zygote. All species or group of organisms can produce more offspring than the environment can support. This just means that there are not enough resources, like food, water, space, for every single organism to survive. Animals and plants and bacteria produce more offspring, more babies, than can survive. Because there is not enough food, water, space for all organisms, organisms have to compete for these limited resources. Therefore, since all organisms are different, there isn't enough resources for everyone, and organisms have to compete for these limited resources. Individuals with favorable genes survive and reproduce more. This should make sense. Those that have the best genes for the environment will survive the competition and therefore will eat and therefore will mate and therefore will reproduce and have more babies. This leads to adaptations within a species. Adaptations are traits that help an individual survive in the environment. For example, camouflage, long legs, hard shells are all examples of adaptations. So again, if organisms with good traits survive and reproduce more, then the majority of organisms in that population will have those traits. Therefore, the population now has those traits or adaptations. So, in summary, the definition of natural selection is the process in which individuals with certain inherited traits have more offspring than others. For example, look at the picture to the right. Let's pretend there is a population of both green and brown bugs. The predators, the birds, prefer to eat the green bugs. Therefore, over time, the brown bugs are the only ones that survive and reproduce. So after many, many years, only brown bugs are left in the population. This means that the brown gene was the favorable gene in the environment, and the adaptation in the bug population is now brown bug bodies. Here's your review. All organisms have different genes or DNA sequences. That's why there are big bugs and small bugs and green bugs and brown bugs. There are more organisms, or in this case bugs, that can live in the environment. Therefore, only some survive, and those that do survive compete for food and space and resources. Maybe the brown bugs survive because they are camouflaged and the birds could not see them. Over time, the bugs that survive, the brown ones, will be more common in the environment. Over many, many years, those bugs will survive and reproduce, and now you have a whole population of brown bugs. So how does natural selection cause evolution? Well, remember all organisms have different DNA and genes. There are way too many organisms for the resources that are available, so organisms compete, some survive, and those that survive reproduce and pass on their favorable genes to their offspring. As a result, populations develop adaptations, like the shape of their bodies, their color, their size, etc. Natural selection over many, many generations leads to evolution. Evolution just means a change in organisms over time. Like, for example, elephants have changed over millions and millions of years. About 34 million years ago, elephants evolved from a group of organisms that looked like pigs, then into mammoths, and then into our current everyday elephants, Asian elephants and African elephants. Horses as well. Horses evolved from organisms that look like deer. What could have caused this? Well, maybe there are some bigger deer like horses than others. The bigger ones survived and reproduced, and this kept happening over millions and millions of years until eventually the only ones left in the population were the large horses. Same thing applies to humans. We evolved from a monkey-like organism. First there were small primates, then monkeys, then apes, and then humans. Our closest relative, of which we share 98% of our DNA sequences, are chimpanzees. We are very closely related to chimpanzees. All those last examples occurred millions of years ago. What about evolution that is occurring right now? Farmers are constantly spraying pesticides on their crops to stop the insects from eating them. These pesticides are really, really toxic to insects and kill most of them, but not all of them. Because like everything else, insects are all different from each other because each one has different DNA or different genes. Those that have the mutation to be resistant or not die from the pesticides survive. Therefore, they reproduce, and over time, we now have a whole population of insects that are resistant to pesticides. This means we cannot kill them with the pesticides. What about antibiotics? When you are sick, you go to the doctor and they give you some antibiotics to kill the bacteria that is infecting you. Well, the antibiotics don't kill all the bacteria. The bacteria that are resistant to the antibiotics survive, reproduce, and now we have a huge population of bacteria that we cannot kill with antibiotics. You can imagine this is a big problem because when you get sick, we now may not have the antibiotics to make you feel better. I'm going to now teach you a trick to answering any open response question on evolution. If you follow my trick, you will always get full credit on an open response question, so pay attention. Here's the 2 fill-in-the-blank sentences you need to memorize. As a result of blank, blank survived, reproduced, and passed on their blank genes to their offspring. The blank population therefore increased. So you are going to use these 2 sentences whenever you answer an open response question. You are simply going to fill in the blanks with the information from the question. For example, let's pretend the question asked you how the beetle population evolved by natural selection. Well, you know that there are a variety of different beetles. The predator, the bird, prefers to eat the green beetles. Now the population of beetles are mostly brown. So remember, you now have to explain how the beetle population evolved by natural selection in this example. You would use this information to fill in the blanks. As a result of birds preferring to eat the green beetles, brown beetles survived, reproduced, and passed on their brown genes to their offspring. The brown beetle population therefore increased. Notice I used this red 2 sentences. I just filled in information from the problem. Let's try another one. Explain how the birds evolved as a result of the drought. Drought means no rain, so really, really dry conditions. Let's look at the data. It looks like at a dry year, the size of the birds' beaks increased. So now use the fill-in-the-blank sentences to answer the question. As a result of what? Drought. Who survived? Birds with big beaks. What genes did they pass on? The big beak genes. What population increased? The big beaked birds. And then put it all together. As a result of the drought, birds with big beaks survived, reproduced, and passed on their big beak genes to their offspring. The big beak birds population therefore increased. Memorize these 2 red sentences. You will use them all the time. You will use them on my tests, and you will use them on the MCAS. That's all I have. Write down your questions and ask me in class.